Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Rosaitis. I'm with the University of Minnesota Center for Educational Innovation and our Preparing Future Faculty program. Today, I'm going to be talking with you about writing your teaching philosophy. In this brief resource, I'll describe the purpose and audience of the teaching philosophy. I'll describe characteristics of successful and unsuccessful teaching philosophies that you may wish to keep in mind as you begin your draft. And finally, we'll end by talking about strategies for writing your teaching philosophy draft. My goal for this resource is to give you the tools you need to begin writing your first teaching philosophy draft, or if you already have a draft, you'll have some understanding and background to revise that and make it even stronger. So let's start by defining the teaching philosophy. So, a teaching philosophy is an essay that articulates your attitudes, values, and beliefs about teaching and learning. It's important that teaching philosophies are anchored in your disciplinary context so that you're not talking about teaching generally, although you can certainly make general statements, but that those statements are anchored in what you hope to achieve for your students in biology or history or chemistry or economics or whatever discipline that you're teaching in. Um, Teaching philosophies use specific examples of practice, and this is extremely important, and we'll spend some time in a few slides talking about this. But teaching philosophies are illustrated by examples of how you enact your attitudes and your values and your beliefs about teaching. What are the things you do in the classroom? And finally, teaching philosophies are personal statements. So that means they're written in the first person. And teaching philosophies are relatively brief documents. They're between 2 and 4 pages typically. With any piece of writing, it's important to keep in mind why you're writing it and who you're writing it for. That is, the purpose and the audience of the piece. And teaching philosophies are no different. There are really two primary purposes for teaching philosophies, each of which has different audiences. Um, the first is a summative purpose. That is for use on the job search, or perhaps if you already have a job, for promotion and tenure. Maybe you're using it for an application for a teaching award or something like that. In other words, a committee of people will be reading your teaching philosophy and making judgments about your practice based on it. So it's a higher stakes use. But teaching philosophies also have an important formative function, and that is they serve as an aid to reflecting on your teaching. They can be useful to share with colleagues as a means of starting a conversation about teaching, or really as a tool for you to think about how well you're enacting your attitudes, values, and beliefs about teaching. Now, the same teaching philosophy can be used for either a summative or a formative purpose. It's not that you need to write two completely different essays. It may be, though, that you'll choose different examples for a summative audience, maybe include things in a formative, a teaching philosophy that you may use to start a discussion with colleagues that may not be used in a summative document. In any case, it's worth keeping in mind why you're writing the document and to whom you're writing it. So, what makes a teaching philosophy successful? Fortunately, Matthew Kaplan and his colleagues at the University of Michigan asked this question of hundreds of search committee chairs, and they took their responses and collated them into this list of 5 characteristics. Um, Successful teaching philosophies offer evidence of practice, they're student centered, they demonstrate reflectiveness, they convey that you value teaching, and finally, they're clear, well written, and readable. So, in the following slides, we're going to go through each of these elements in turn and talk about some strategies that you can think about as you begin drafting your own teaching philosophy. Perhaps the most important characteristic of strong teaching philosophies is that they offer evidence of practice. That is, they include specific examples of what you will do in order to support or enact your attitudes, values, and beliefs about teaching. And the converse is also true. Weak teaching philosophies tend not to have specific examples or offer evidence of practice. They include high level statements without any support, which makes them sound unconvincing, quite frankly. They sound like boilerplate or like the author hasn't thought enough about what teaching really means to him or her. And all of those things obviously are what you want to avoid when you're writing a teaching philosophy. So let's look at an example of what offering evidence of practice might be. So here we have a statement that I think is a perfectly fine statement. Someone writing a teaching philosophy in history states, I believe it's important to make history relevant by connecting it with students' lives and interests. It's a great statement. It's a laudable a goal for teaching, but by itself, it doesn't say very much. It's too high level. We don't know how this person is going to do it. Are you doing it through the way you design your course, or through the assignments that you use, or in class activities, or is it through your assessments? How are you actually going to be doing this? That's what's missing, and that's what the specific example is. So, in the next slide, let's take a look at what that specific example might be. So here the author adds to the initial statement about making history relevant by writing, I often begin my lectures with a news article, video segment, or cartoon germane to the day's topic so that students have a context in which they can think about how history relates to their current lives. So that's an example of a specific that illustrates the general claim that the author is making. And it also gives the reader a sense of what it's like to be in their classroom. I think the best teaching philosophies, through their judicious choice of examples and topics to focus on, should really introduce you to the teacher, to what it's like to be in that person's classroom. How is it? How do they interact with students? What kinds of courses do they design? In a sense, you should know something about these kinds of things through the teaching philosophy, and it's that sort of specificity that specific examples offer. Now, the question I get a lot from people, particularly graduate students and postdocs, is, well, I don't have any teaching experience. How am I supposed to offer examples of practice? And this is a really good question. Generally, what we recommend is that you write in terms of what you will do as a teacher. So rather than saying, I often begin my lectures with a news article, you may say, I plan to begin my lectures with a news article, or I will begin my lectures with a news article. You can speak about the kinds of things that you will do in the classroom when you actually start teaching. I know this is an unsatisfactory answer for a lot of people, but without teaching experience, it's the best I think you can do in order to talk about specifics. And let me say too that a lot of people who haven't taught don't feel like they have authority to speak about what they'll do in the classroom. But I would like to disabuse you of that notion right now. You, as graduate students and postdocs, have been in the classroom for many, many years, 15 plus. You have seen a lot of really good teachers and you've seen a lot of poor teachers, likely. You know what good instruction means to you. So you can speak with authority from the point of view of the student, from the point of view of the learner, about what you would do in the classroom. And that's the kind of voice that you should use. The second characteristic of successful teaching philosophies is that they show instructors who are student centered. So, what does it mean to be a student centered instructor? For student centered instructors, student learning and student success is at the center of what they do. It's their primary goal. And that, in a sense, informs the way that they design their courses, the way that they design their class sessions, and the way that they interact with students. So rather than seeing their job primarily as a transmitter of information that students then learn on their own, the student centered instructor creates or facilitates opportunities for students to learn the material. So, what does that look like in a classroom? Well, it has lots of different features. It may be that student centered instructors ask students what they're learning, what they know. They may give them surveys during class or use understanding checks or have students talk to one another and then use that feedback as a means of gauging students' understanding. If students don't understand something, the student centered instructor would then spend more time helping students actually get that knowledge before moving on to something else. So, like I said, student learning, and student success is the their primary focus and motivation. It's also important to understand that being a student centered instructor is independent of your instructional modality or your teaching method. So a lot of people will just naturally assume, well, you can't be student centered if you are a lecturer, or that all student centered instructors use group work. And that's just not correct. You can be a student centered lecturer. In fact, there are many of them. The student centered lecturers, though, look a little different than what you might think of as a traditional lecturer. They may be the ones who are asking students to solve problems in class, or who are um, giving students understanding checks or feedback surveys to judge understanding. Lots of different ways that you can be concerned about student learning using lectures. So, too, just because you have students sitting together in a group doesn't necessarily mean that you're student centered. It's the care and degree to which you design and facilitate those groups to achieve student learning, right? To manage them effectively, that defines whether and how you're student centered. So, I think that's important to remember when you're choosing specific examples for your teaching philosophy. Um, and I think student or specific examples are very important when you're talking about the ways in which you're student centered and how your classroom is student centered. It's not enough simply to say that I'm a student centered instructor. Um, on its own, that's a vague and meaningless statement. It's the specific examples, as we saw when we talked about them in the previous slides, that actually enliven this. Successful teaching philosophies also demonstrate reflectiveness on the part of the instructor. So I think the most effective instructors are those who really think about their practice, who gather information about it, and then make decisions about how to make their teaching better based on that information. That's what reflectiveness means. So, in your teaching philosophy, can you give examples of how you do that? Maybe it's, as we mentioned in the previous slides, um, using various classroom assessment techniques where you're asking students how well they understand a particular subject. Maybe you've given students surveys on how they like a particular assignment, and then you've made instructional decisions, maybe changed your course or changed your assignments based on student feedback. Um, Maybe you can talk about the ways in which, at the end of the term, you reflect on what you've done and make changes. Give examples of the kinds of changes you've made and how those types of things have improved your courses. Another example that some people often put into teaching philosophies is examples of things that didn't go well and what you learned from those. That shows reflectiveness as well. So, can you get those into your teaching philosophy? If you can, you're communicating to your audience that you are a responsive and reflective teacher, and that's the kind of instructors that hiring committees are looking for. Successful teaching philosophies also convey that the instructor values teaching. Now, on one hand, this sounds obvious, right? I don't think anyone would write that they don't value teaching in a teaching philosophy, but it's sometimes easy to convey that through your choice of examples or perhaps the tone that you're affecting. Um, if you're writing about the way you assess students and you have a tone that suggests that you think students are prone to cheat or take advantage of you or they're lazy, those kinds of things suggest that you have an adversarial relationship to teaching, and that might suggest that you don't value it or you don't value your students. So often this value is suggested through the examples you use and the tone that you convey in your teaching. It's the kind of thing that you should be on the lookout, right, for making sure that you're actually projecting that kind of tone, the tone that suggests that, yes, I value this, it's important, and I feel it's a calling that's worthy of my time and attention. Something that you should pay attention to and ask the readers of your teaching philosophy to pay attention to as they're reading it for you. Finally, successful teaching philosophies are well written, clear, and readable. As I mentioned before, teaching philosophies are personal essays of about 2 to 4 double spaced pages, and they're kind of an outlier in academic writing where, in most cases, you strive for objectivity and you follow a set format. For example, in the research articles you read, maybe there's a literature review followed by a methods section and finally a discussion. Teaching philosophies can follow any number of formats, and in the following slides, we'll talk about some of those formats and some of the things that you may discuss in your teaching philosophy. But in any case, the teaching philosophy really should communicate who you are as a teacher. You want your subjectivity to come through in a teaching philosophy because that's, in fact, what you're conveying to your reader, who you are as a teacher and how you operate in the classroom. So the format you choose to do that is really up to you. But in any case, you want to make sure that it's engaging, that it's, like I said, well written, clear, and readable, but that it holds the reader's attention and interest. Now let's turn our attention to writing the teaching philosophy, beginning with the topics that you might discuss. So in this slide, I've listed some of the elements that are commonly written about in teaching philosophies. And these are some of the things that you may consider writing about in your own statement. So first of all, you might address your goals for student learning. That is what you want students to know or be able to do by the end of a course or perhaps by the end of a major. So you might talk about how your goals differ for majors and non-majors or introductory and advanced level courses. You may talk about how your goals align with what you believe students should take from college and bring into the working world. Or you might talk about differing goals for, let's say, graduate students and undergraduates. There's a lot of room here. And of course, it'll depend on your teaching context as well. The other thing that you should address in a teaching philosophy are your teaching methods. Some of these may come up in the specific examples that you use, as we've discussed before, but these are opportunities for you to talk about the ways you interact with students or the kinds of instructional materials you choose or the way you use group work or any other kinds of innovative strategies that you're proud to try in your classroom. A common topic to discuss in teaching philosophies are assessment strategies. These are the ways that you examine students. What kinds of tests do you use? What kinds of assignments? Do you use authentic assignments? How do you give students opportunities to show what they know? If you use low stakes assessment or formative assessment, these might be things to discuss in a teaching philosophy as well. Um, Increasingly, hiring committees are looking for you to articulate your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and you should definitely do this in your teaching philosophy. This could include how you design your courses to be inclusive, how you provide flexibility to accommodate diverse learners, how you interact with students to create an inclusive environment, or how your identity and your students' identities affect your instructional decisions. Now, it's common for hiring committees to request a diversity statement that speaks to these issues, but you should also address this in your teaching philosophy as well. And finally, you may want to talk about how you reflect on and improve your teaching. We discussed this a little bit on the slide where we talked about reflective practice. Um, what kinds of methods do you use to get student feedback? And what kinds of changes have you made to your instruction based on that feedback? And how has it improved your course and sort of helped you develop as a teacher? As I mentioned before, there's no set format for teaching philosophies. In a sense, because it's a personal statement, it should reflect your individuality, and thus you can craft it any way that you think makes sense for what you want to communicate. That said, though, there are some common formats that you might consider. The article by Sullivan and Kearns that's listed in your resource handout is a good resource for different kinds of drafting structures and strategies. So I would recommend you take a look at that as well. But the teaching philosophy can be structured as a 5 paragraph essay. You're all familiar from that from your school days, where you have an introduction and a conclusion, and then several paragraphs in between in which you might talk about discrete issues like we discussed on the last slide, maybe the way you create an inclusive classroom or your goals for student learning or how you assess students, those kinds of things. Um, you might structure your teaching philosophy draft as a series of memorable moments. So maybe 3 or 4 things that stand out to you from your teaching that illustrate different aspects of your teaching. Maybe the degree to which you're student centered or the ways in which you interact with students. So it may be a collection of vignettes. You might organize it around a story of your teaching, maybe an example of working with a student um, and helping that student overcome challenges. Maybe it's a story of your own development as a teacher, starting from where you were, going through challenges, and developing into the teacher you are now. All of these kinds of strategies or approaches to organizing the draft, I think, are perfectly legitimate. You can use subheadings in a teaching philosophy if you'd like. Like I said, it's really kind of up to you. The one thing that I would recommend, though, is because it's a personal essay, I would strongly recommend avoiding sort of academic gestures, things like footnotes, and that those types of things. I think they take away from that sort of informal feel. If you want to cite something or use a quote, I think that's a great idea. Don't use a footnote. Maybe attribute it in the text somehow to make it sound very sort of spoken and, like I said, informal. It should be a statement of you, almost as if you're talking to a colleague. The last thing I'll say about writing the teaching philosophy is to pay attention to the process that you use. Um, Everyone has different processes for writing. Um, Mine typically involves 3 distinct steps, and this is what I tell my students to follow as they're writing their first teaching philosophy drafts. The first is a stage where you brainstorm, you generate ideas. The second is a stage where you take those ideas and organize them into a rough draft. And then the third is where you edit that rough draft and polish it into something that's clear and readable. Um, if you follow that particular format, I think you'll have success. But I would recommend that you spend a lot of time at the beginning generating ideas. Don't skip that step. Most people haven't spent a lot of time thinking deeply about what they believe about good teaching. They often fall back on the norms and the practices that are common in their disciplines, but maybe those things don't align with who you are or who you want to be as an instructor. So spend time generating ideas. I often recommend doing it by free writing, where you spend 5 minutes and just write on a particular topic, like, what do I believe about teaching? And then write, don't stop. Even if what you're writing sounds like gibberish, there might be some useful things that you can pull out of that and develop. Um, the other thing is that the teaching philosophy is not an essay that lends itself well to being written in a single sitting. It really doesn't. You need to break it up over time. That's why I say spend time at the beginning, generating ideas, step away from it for a day or two, draft it, step away from it for a day or two, and then edit it, and then have a colleague read through it as well. Get a separate pair of eyes on the document, take their feedback, and make your revisions, so that the writing of the teaching philosophy really is a very iterative process as you're moving through these different stages and writing the document. Give yourself time and space. Many people find this to be a really challenging essay to write. But I think if you break it into the stages like I've discussed, you'll find it to be a lot easier.
Thank you for viewing the Center for Educational Innovation presentation on writing the teaching philosophy statement. As further support for this presentation, we've collected resources together in a Google folder. The Google folder is at the following link: z.umn.edu/teaching philosophy resources GS. Again, z.umn.edu/teaching philosophy resources GS. In this resource, you'll find samples, suggestions for your drafting process, including some prompts, and a link to a tutorial that walks through the entire process again for later review, building in some examples of things that work, that could work better, and that don't work. Again, thank you for viewing this presentation.